Good afternoon, everyone. Today on Kurentovanje, we welcome Dr. Noah Charney, who will be presenting the Slovenian and Slavic myths in Slovenia as a tourist destination. I'm Nicole Kurentovanje, and on behalf of more than 20 Cleveland Kurentovanje volunteer organizers, I welcome you to the 12th annual Cleveland Kurentovanje. Dobrodošli. Thank you to you for participating today, and also to the unwavering support from our volunteers, sponsors, partners, and grantees. Over the last 12 years, the festival has grown to a multi-day arts and culture festival. Not only are we Cleveland's largest Mardi Gras celebration, but we have North America's largest collection of Kurenti, which attracts people from all walks of life throughout Northeast Ohio, the United States, and now with our online offerings like today's presentation, beyond. Before we begin with today's interesting talk, I want to thank our sponsors. Our 2024 presenting sponsors, American Mutual Life Association, or AMLA, and Shaliga Drug, located in St. Clair Superior neighborhood, have been outstanding supporters, and we are so grateful for their support, as well as all the other sponsors who have graciously provided us with the financial means to bring programming like this for free to you, our participants. Cleveland Kurentovanje is also supported in part by residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture Foundation. We are also very grateful to our partners and numerous volunteers. This is perhaps one of the most grassroots Mardi Gras festivals there are, and we could not do it without everybody pulling together as a community to bring this to life. And we are so grateful and thankful for the support. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Noah Charney to the program. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you today. We're going to have two parts to our talk. One is about my role as Ambassador of Slovenian Tourism, and one is about a book that I wrote that just came out called Slavic Myths, which includes Slovenian myths, of course. But if possible, if we can get our high-tech program sorted, maybe we can do a short 2-minute video that we would use to kick things off.
Perfect.
A millennium ago, the first known Slovenian words were written. 5 centuries on, the author of the first printed book in the Slovenian language, a Slovene Protestant reformer named Primož Trubar, lit a bonfire of what would prove to be a culture on the rise. From there, despite difficulties, Slovenian culture was unstoppable. And what's my part in all this? I'm a professor of art history and a writer. I'm an American who has lived in London, Paris, Florence, Rome, but in the end, I chose Slovenia as my forever home. I was so enchanted by its great architect, the modernist mystic Jože Plečnik, that I moved here. From then on, I devoted myself to exploring the wonders of Slovenian culture and sharing it in writing with those who've not had the chance to encounter it yet. On the world map, Slovenia stands out with great writers, architects, artists, musicians. I'm lucky to call a few of them friends. Friendship and love are integral to the Slovenian language itself. It is one of the few to have preserved the dual form. It's all here, waiting for the wise explorer to discover, as so many others have before.
So that is an example of the sort of stuff that I do to promote Slovenian tourism. But I didn't start out that way. I'll give you a little bit of background about how I got here. So like I think the majority of expatriate men in Slovenia. I guess Slovenia's primary import is foreign husbands, because for some reason I met dozens of foreign men who married Slovenian women, and I don't know if I know a single foreign woman who's married a Slovenian man. I must just not be hanging out in the right circles. I'm not sure if that means anything. But I came here for love, of course. I met my wife, whose name is Urška, in Prešeren Square in the center of Ljubljana. And we lived in a lot of different places before we decided to settle in Slovenia. And when we did decide to settle there, I embarked on a proactive attempt to meet all the interesting people that I had heard about. And it was intentional, because I thought, if I'm moving to a new country, then I want to, break the ice and get to know it better, and get to know it through people whose work I had encountered. And I had lived in a lot of different places. So I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. But I did my postgraduate studies all in England, and I lived in Paris when I was 16 through an abroad program from my boarding school. And from that moment on, I decided I wanted to live in Europe. I just felt it was exciting, and it felt at home there, and just it was a great way for it. And the only question was where I would find the future Mrs. Charney, and which country she might be from. As long as she was European, I was very flexible. Given a different set of circumstances, I might be giving a talk right now to, I don't know, a Portuguese American festival, or a Norwegian one, just depending on where I wound up finding the future wife. So I found mine while I was visiting Ljubljana. And Ljubljana I first encountered back in 2000, when I was still an undergraduate student. And I remember borrowing a Lonely Planet guidebook to Europe on a shoestring. And I had never been to this sort of Eurailing trip before. You probably know the term, where you get like a 2-week or 3-week pass, and you can go on unlimited trains throughout Europe. And a lot of American students will do that as a chance to just sample what a lot of different places are like. But I gave this book to 5 different friends who had already been on a Eurailing trip. And I asked them for annotations. Tell me what they liked, what they didn't like. And without conspiring with each other, all 5 said that Lake Bled in Slovenia was the most beautiful place they had seen during their Eurailing trip. And I remember I was in Budapest, and I thought, should I go to Slovakia or Slovenia? And they all said I should go to Bled. So I said, I'll go to Slovenia. And I visited Ljubljana and Bled, and I was totally blown away. And we fast forward a bit, and I was essentially auditioning European places that I might like to live. And if there was a problem, it was that I liked all of them. So I've lived for at least a month and as long as several years in, I think, 8 different places in Europe. Rome, Florence, Venice, Orvieto in Italy, Cambridge and London in England, Leiden in the Netherlands, Madrid in Spain, Paris and Po in France. So it was quite a long list, and I liked all of them. So why did I end up with Slovenia? It wasn't just because I married a Slovene. In fact, we did something of an objective study of the highest quality of life for the lowest cost of living. And we found that Slovenia won by a long shot. This is talking about Europe, of course. I haven't lived in all the countries in the world, but based on this objective attempt to study, Slovenia was the best place to be, especially for young families. So we actually lived in Italy when we were first married, but when we decided that we wanted to have kids, we thought Slovenia is a perfect place, really due to a lot of the things that are left over from the socialist system. Basically, they kept the good stuff and got rid of the not so good stuff. And they kept things that essentially see for a very small amount of money or nothing, as in it's paid for as part of your taxes, you get a lot of things taken care of for you that we Americans think is quite amazing. So for example, you get 18 months paid maternity leave for each kid. That's a pretty good deal compared to the US, where I think you can sometimes get 2 or 3 weeks and that's it. So that's just one of loads of examples, but I wound up listing a lot of them when I was trying to decide where we're going to live, and there were so many of these benefits. We have really good medical system here and insurance that is essentially free. We have great early childhood education. It's a very safe place. It's one of the safest countries in the world. It's one of the greenest, cleanest. All of these things cobbled together to this mosaic of this ideal country. And still, having lived here for more than a decade full time, I'm equally in love with it, and that's a good sign that it's a real deal. So imagine me having just proposed to the future Mrs. Charney, and I'm trying to figure out, I'm moving to this place, Slovenia. I've been to it to visit. I thought it was beautiful, but I don't really know anything there. So who do I know? The only people I know are celebrities, Slovene celebrities who I've encountered through the work they produce. I mean, musicians, artists, authors, filmmakers. So the first person I wrote to was Vlado Kreslin. Some of you will have heard of him. He's by far Slovenia's most famous and popular musician. It's a bit like me writing to Bruce Springsteen. And I figured he would have this entourage, or like managers and bodyguards and whatnot, because if you wrote to Bruce Springsteen, you never actually reach him. And within a few minutes, Vlado writes back and says, yeah, why not next time in Slovenia, I should come over to his house. And this is like, it's so seamless to engage with Slovenes of all walks of life. You want a foot massage from the prime minister, it's doable. We joke that there's 6 degrees of separation in the US. In Slovenia, it's probably like 1.5 degrees. And especially if you're involved in sort of the cultural world, I'm going to say like writers, artists, filmmakers, musicians, there's probably like 200 people in Ljubljana who are engaged proactively in this world. And so you meet one of them, you meet others. And so I targeted meeting these exciting people whose work I liked, but I didn't know them, on the hopes that some of them would become friends. And I was a little bit, I wasn't just writing out of the blue. One thing is that Slovenes, I think a lot of Europeans are sort of more intrigued to meet an American than they might be if I had come from, I don't know, Kazakhstan or whatever you might pick. I also was a writer, and part of my initial opening parlay was to say, could I interview you? Because I'd love to write an article about you for a magazine. I didn't know which magazine. I wasn't promising anything that I couldn't achieve, but this was the first initial step. And even for big celebrities in Slovenia, it's rare that they're written about in Anglophone publication. So that was like the lure that I used to get to meet these people. And as a result, I met loads of them very quickly. And then one introduced me to another, and many of them became friends. We did collaborations with many of them as well. And it's been a real privilege. It helps that I'm basically the only Anglophone writer of profile in the country. So a lot of projects I get to participate in that in another context would be hard to pull off, or I would need to hyper specialize. Even I used to live in Rome, and I thought Rome was where I wanted to be forever. It's still probably my favorite city. But there are probably a few dozen Anglophone writers of note, if not more than that, who live there. Whereas in Slovenia, there was pretty much just me. So anytime there was a project to do, people were up for it, and they thought it was cool. So I got to do all of these projects. And initially, I did projects based on a book idea. And a handful of them you can get if you're interested. I have some with me. One of them that came out last year is called Gold Wine. And it's about rebula. Rebula is an indigenous grape, a white grape, indigenous to the border region between Slovenia and Italy. And ground zero for it is Goriška Brda. And this book is the story of wine in Slovenia, and particularly this grape varietal. And it's sort of a tourist guide also to Goriška Brda. Another one is Slovenian cuisine. These are books that are published by big American publishers. You can get them on Amazon or wherever you like. Slovenian cuisine is a book that I wrote with JB or Janez Bratož, who is one of Slovenia's most famous chefs. He's considered the godfather of fine dining there. He was the first person to bring to Yugoslavia some things that are obvious to us now, and we're used to them as nouvelle cuisine from the 80s, but they took a while to get to Yugoslavia. Things like foams and carpaccio and rare steak. These sound so obvious that they don't need mentioning now, but in 1991, when Slovenia got independence, people didn't have this. This was quite uncommon. You have a steak, it would be hammered quite thin and be well done, and you would taste it as a texture with whatever sauce was on top. You wouldn't have a rare steak. So he's the godfather there. And what we did was spent a summer driving around eating things. And we did this cookbook based on 20 indigenous ingredients. And it's basically travel memoirs with recipes that I don't think anybody's ever going to cook, because he's a super fancy Michelin type chef. They're complicated recipes. So just look at the pictures and read the fun stories. I wound up doing my PhD on Jože Plečnik, the famous Slovenian architect, and that became a book as well. And then I'm probably best known in Slovenia for this book. It's called Slovenology, Living and Traveling in the World's Best Country. And there's a Slovene edition, German, Italian as well. And I'm delighted because the Slovene edition is equally popular to the English one. There's been a bestseller, and that's how most people know me here. And that's why I started to get into doing some other activities related to promoting Slovenia. In my day job, I would say, is I'm a professor of art history, specializing in art crime, things like art theft and forgery. And I've published over 20 books, and I also do TV presenting and audio presenting, like in radio and podcasts. But I've heard my own stories about art far too often. And so I'm most excited to be like the enthusiastic American who thinks Slovenia is the best. That's been my shtick for a few years now, and it's much more refreshing. So I do a bunch of things related to that. And if anyone's interested in learning more about any of them, you can message me, or you can message Nicole, and we can throw some links up. So one of the things that I started doing is appearing in official capacities promoting Slovenia tourism. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about less interesting what I'm doing than what Slovenia is doing to try to promote tourism. And also, you'll find interesting, not have too many more tourists than they already have in certain places, because they have quite a lot and they don't want it to ever become a mass tourism destination. So what am I doing? The main thing of the last few years is I host the official English language podcast for Slovenian tourism. It's called Feel Slovenia. It's now in its 3rd season. I was totally delighted and surprised. We won a gold award for best travel podcast at a European festival last year. And it's free. You can listen to it wherever you get podcasts. So Feel Slovenia, the podcast. I also just started one for Bled. I'm helping with Bled tourism. So that's that lake that, if you know Slovenia, it's probably the most iconic image. This absolutely picture perfect alpine lake with one island in the middle of it, with a little church on the island and a fairy tale Disney castle on a cliff overlooking it. And so the Bled podcast, it just started, and you can listen to that for free anywhere you get podcasts. Then I appear in some videos like the one you just saw, which is the official video of promoting Slovenian culture. And I do some book writing as well, and I'll do sort of appearances at different events, either in Slovene or in English. So I went to London and Frankfurt Book Fair. Slovenia was the focal nation last November at the Frankfurt Book Fair. So it was a chance to promote Slovenian culture. And it's a great honor for me, and it's lots of fun. And people are just super excited about this country, and they either don't know about it, but they've heard good things, or they know about it and they think it's great. So I haven't heard a single negative thing at all. One of the best things we have going lately is Luka Doncic, as by far the most famous Slovenian. And he's just a bundle of fun. I'm sure you're all Cleveland basketball fans, but maybe some of you cheer for the Dallas Mavericks because Luka Doncic is a wonderful player to watch. And he's been a great promoter of Slovenia. And then I also do things like lead some tours. I don't do tours normally, but I work with a company called Atlas Obscura, which is a really fun, it's an online magazine. It's kind of like Wikipedia for geographic destinations, usually with quirky, fun stories. And for many years now, I've led a tour called Forest to Table in Alpine Slovenia. And it's great because what I like doing is taking people on a behind-the-scenes, very personal tour of places that they could go on their own, but meeting people who you couldn't meet without knowing someone who knows them. So for example, this famous chef, JB Janez Bratož, we don't just eat at his restaurant, we go foraging in the morning with his professional forager. We bring in whatever we find, and then he invites us into the kitchen and he improvises with everything we found and feeds us lunch standing in his kitchen. It's that kind of thing that you couldn't, even if you knew about it, you couldn't do it unless you were friends with people behind the scenes. And we go to Bled, we go to the beautiful mountain pass of Jezersko. We have multiple schnapps tastings Who knew that schnapps was such a wonderful, delicious thing? I had certainly never encountered schnapps culture before Slovenia. And now my first encounter with it, my grandmother-in-law, it was the village schnapps champion, and I was the international member of the board of judges for a local village schnapps competition. So anything you need to know, just ask. Actually, 2 days ago, speaking of competitions, I was one of the judges at the best pizza maker in Slovenia competition. I know this isn't a Slovene thing, but these are the kind of things you get to do if you come to a country that's so relatively small, and you get to know people who invite you to do cool activities. So this has been a real delight. So let me shift gears a little bit and talk about what the tourism strategy is for Slovenia. One of the things that people get excited about is the idea that Slovenia is very green. However, we as tourists don't choose where we go on holiday just because a place is, very moral in the way that they approach tourism. That's a bonus, but it's not the reason we're going there. So some of the things they do is try to work with the tourist boards, and there's the national one, and there's Tourism Ljubljana and Bled tourism. Those are the strongest ones and the ones I work with most often, to try to come up with things that will encourage people to come visit, and with the awareness that it's pretty rare for somebody to make an entire holiday, especially coming transatlantic, and they're just going to Slovenia. Usually it's something plus Slovenia. Now that could be Venice, which is 2 hours away from Ljubljana. It could be Vienna, which is 3.5 hours from Ljubljana. It could be the start of, I don't know, a Croatian coast road trip, but it's usually something plus Slovenia, and that's fine. If you're hardcore enough to say, I'm going to go to Slovenia for 2 weeks, I'm going to see everything there is to see, and that's all I'm doing, more power to you, but that's not going to happen all that often. And keeping that in mind is fine. The other thing to keep in mind is that Slovenia would like tourists who are staying longer and engaging more, and they're not after quantity. And that's something that's important. They are steering clear of mass tourism. They don't want cruise ships. They don't want big bus tours. They still have some, but they're not promoting to it. And one of the things that's a little bit surreal, I've now worked with Bled very closely for more than a year. In a moment, I'll show you a different sort of video I made for them. And I'm also finishing a book. This book I mentioned about Slovenia in general, which is part travel memoir, part very subjective, personal, fun, hopefully funny guide to Slovenia, called Slovenology. I'm just finishing a book called Bledology, which is the same concept for Bled and the region around it. And now I know Bled inside and out. And part of the Bled strategy is they actually have more tourists than they want per year. So what do you do with that? Well, what you do is try to get them to stay out of the main core center that everybody's going to come visit anyway. And you need to show them what there is to do. And I've seen repeatedly this works if I go do something and I either make a video about it or I write an article about it. People see the video or read the article and they say, I want to do what he did. So the strategy is the tourist board says, this is what we would like tourists to do. So let's have Noah go and do it, and he's going to write about it. And then tourists literally will bring the article and say, this is what I want to do. And I write for things like The Guardian and The Washington Post and The Atlantic. And these articles, people will literally show up and say, how do I get to go do what he was doing? And with that in mind, doing a whole book out of it, or a podcast series, which is like a guided tour where you get me in your ear if you want to be there alongside you, or suggesting itineraries is a good way to go. So for Bled, if you've been to Bled, or if you haven't and you've thought about going, you probably know there's 3 main things there that everybody knows about. And for many people, that's as much as they know. One is this beautiful island with a little church on it. 2, this spectacular castle that looks like a Disney movie. And 3 is cream cake, bleska kremna rezina, or kremšnita, as everybody calls it. And it's a very good, it's not light, but a special occasion cake. And everybody goes there for the cream cake, and they take a boat. There's a special type of boat called a pletna, which is to say it's like a Venetian gondola, it's not quite right, but it's a guy rowing from the back. It's much wider than a gondola and seats, I think, 14 people, 7 on each side. And it's a classical way to go to the island. And then you go up to the castle for the view. And then the question is, what else have you got? And for most people, they wouldn't be able to tell you what else you should do there. So that's like a day trip, but then what else do you do? And so I'm trying to answer that. And this is something I do for Ljubljana. We're starting a podcast that hasn't launched yet called Beyond Ljubljana, which is, everybody's going to go to the center. That's fine. But the question is, what else can you do? And here are things that are just outside the center, sometimes only like a 5-minute walk from the center, that are worth checking out to try to diffuse the quantity of tourists. Because the tourists, you might think by number it's good, but if you have mass tourism, it often includes a whole bus full of people pulling into the center. It feels like, for locals, like the center's being clogged up, but they aren't providing an economic benefit because they're getting out of their tour bus, they're taking some selfies, maybe they're getting an ice cream, maybe they buy a postcard at most, and then they get back on the bus. The tourists you want are the ones who are going to be there for more than one night. And to be totally frank, they're basically going to spend more money there. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, because you're wanting to stimulate your economy in exchange for that feeling of busyness that comes with being a tourist destination. And so one of the ways around this is to spread them out, to suggest things that are off the central core path. And then the other thing is to encourage people to stay longer. So if I can say, there's a day's worth of stuff to do at Bled Castle alone, then a lot of people will go, they'll, buy their ticket, they'll take a selfie from the battlements, and then they'll leave, and they're like, oh, why the ticket feels expensive because I did that. What I suggest is you go and you spend like a day there, including you have lunch there, then all of a sudden the tickets you buy, if it's an all-day event, it actually sounds like a really good deal. And you just have to point people in the right direction. Lay things out for people. Don't say this is what you have to do, say this is what you can do. So that's what I wind up doing at a national level, Ljubljana and Bled in particular. And in terms of Bled, I think maybe I'll show you just one more short 2-minute video, but it's a very different type. So I've already appeared in enough videos that are documentary style, where I'm walking around talking to the camera saying this is what we're going to do. There's a whole series of videos that haven't released yet where I'm going around Ljubljana doing the same thing. And you saw the Slovenia national tourism video for culture, which was very beautifully done, but it's more sort of poetic rather than specific about what you should do. Well, with the same filmmaker, who's Slovenia's most successful young filmmaker and photographer, his name is Cyril Jazbec. He's a National Geographic photographer. We made something that was very different. It was more of a narrative, cinematic, like mini movie. We were trying to figure out what the context should be. And I basically grabbed 2 of my buddies who are also expats married to Slovenes. And we made a film that's supposed to have a little bit of the aesthetic of a Wes Anderson movie, going around Bled and making Bled look like it does look, which is a magical place, but also showing people things that are outside of the everyday path. So Eric, if we can show that other video, that would be great.
I'd love to tell you every detail of the story, but the beginning and most of the middle and the end are a bit faulty. I brought my buddies to the most beautiful place in the world so they could help me find the perfect place to propose to the love of my life. Even though this place is heaven on earth, and we were determined, not everything went according to plan. The perfect hiding spots were inside desserts. While our bellies grew, my gut feeling was telling me to move our butts. While hiking, our fellowship met Rickley, a spiritual guide, who taught us that we must get lost in the forest in order to reach the castle. We thought it was a metaphor. Turns out, it wasn't. Bled can leave you speechless, but it can also provide all the answers. With a little help from my friends, the stress melted away. Whatever the question, Bled Slovenia is the answer. So now, I am ready, knocking on the door, and so are we.
So that video is called Adventure of a Lifetime, made with two of my expat buddies, two other imported husbands. And we went around various locations at Lake Bled to try to make something that would invite you to go there without being a traditional tourist video. So this is another approach you can take. People are used to documentary style with a presenter speaking to camera saying, this is what I'm going to do, and then you see them go do it. That's fine. But trying to do something that's a little bit outside of the ordinary. And the filmmaker, Cyril Yazbets, also is going to be the photographer for this Bledology book that's going to come out at the end of this year. So when we were putting it together, we were trying to figure out what sort of plot line it should be. And the basic idea was Luka Doncic proposed to his fiancée at Lake Bled, and it became a viral Instagram photo of him on one knee proposing to her. And he's got, a zillion followers, so this traveled around the world. And inspired by that this buddy of mine, the protagonist of this video, Mel, was going to look for the ideal spot to propose to his fiancée. And John and I, as his two friends, were sort of up to no good and wanting to go on a holiday with some buddies and not be so serious. And it was enough of a hit that they've commissioned a second one. It's going to be in winter. You know what the problem is? Winter in the Alps here is not quite as wintry as it used to be. we haven't had enough consistent snow to plan filming, so maybe next winter is going to be better, but that's going to be their honeymoon. And we have to figure out what to film. But anyway, it's great fun to do this sort of things. And what we did was try to create a sort of mythology of the place. Of course, there are real myths related to Lake Bled, but we're trying to create a modern one and have that dreamy Wes Anderson-y vibe, with especially when it comes to the color of the final film and the costumes, which feel a little bit like you're moving through this fairy tale. Which leads me to the second half of the talk today. So one book I have to wave at you that I haven't done yet is called, it's so shiny and beautiful, I can't take credit for that. It's called The Slavic Myths. It's published by Thames and Hudson, which is a famous art press. They make very beautiful books. And I wrote it with a friend of mine named Svetlana Slapšák, who's actually a Serbian professor, but she's lived for decades in Ljubljana, and she's a mythographer, so she's a specialist in classical myths. And the book is very beautiful with lots of beautiful pictures and prints. Of course, as I flip through the pages, I'm not finding a single one. They commissioned these amazing woodcut style prints in black and white that really bring it to life. And this is about Slavic mythology in general. So Slovenian myths are just one component of it. The cover's so shiny, I keep on wiggling it and slightly mesmerized. So this casts a wider net, but I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about Slavic myths in general, and then mention some Slovenian ones. When I was writing it, I didn't know a lot about the subject. What I know how to do as a professor and writer is how to teach myself things and then translate it into something that is accessible and entertaining for anyone. That's my superpower if I have one. And so it doesn't matter what the subject is. So I may be trained as an art historian, but approaching a mythology that I don't really know well is not a problem if I have someone who can coach me through it and I know how to research it. And then the writing of it, I'm trying to write always to the widest possible audience because I'm not the least bit interested in writing academic articles. And what I found fascinating was to learn what mythology is and some of the differences between myths, folk tales, fairy tales, and legends. So we tend to use the terms interchangeably, but in academic spheres, they're actually distinct categories of story. I read about this extensively in the book, but I'm just going to give you the quickie version now because I found it so interesting. So folk tales are stories that are passed down orally for which no author is known. That's a folk tale. Fairy tales are like folk tales, but where the author is known. So if it's a fairy tale, we know who the author was. If it's a folk tale, it's a story passed on from generation to generation, usually by women, and older women were the traditional storytellers in the family, and nobody knows who first wrote the story, or even if it was written, it may have grown up sort of more organically. These stories usually involve things like you probably can imagine from Disney movies: children in danger, animals that behave like people, witches and magic, princes and princesses, and children were the primary audience, and usually older women were the primary storytellers. In fact, you probably have heard of the brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm from Grimm's fairy tales. The Grimm brothers actually employed a young girl to listen to stories told by an old woman who would only tell her stories to children. And the girl would listen and then scoot off and repeat the stories as accurately as possible to the Grimm brothers, who then wrote them down, and they eventually published it in their famous volume of fairy tales. So they turned folk tales, where we didn't know the author, but this little old lady was telling them, but she would only tell them to children. And they turned them into fairy tales because they wrote their own versions of them, but tried to keep them as closely as possible to what the girl told them that the old lady had told her. It's like a game of telephone. And this was published in 1812, and this is where a lot of the most famous fairy tales that we know of comes from, and a lot of the ones that were made into Disney movies, and that then becomes how we know them. But the Disney versions are very much cleaned up. The original ones are quite creepy and gory, and there's like blood and dying and the kind of things that you don't have in the Disney movie version of it. And there's usually morals behind the stories, often with the goal, honestly, of scaring children into good behavior and sticking to the rules of their parents. We're going to be straight up about this. That's usually the reason that these stories were told to children. Now, myths and legends are different. Myths often involve God or the gods in a pagan context, and they help explain natural phenomenon that the ancients could not understand scientifically, including things like origin stories of the world or places within it. Legends, by contrast, are stories that take place in some unnamed ancient past that involve mortal heroes. So not the gods, but humans, and in some cases demigods like Hercules. And these mortals go on adventures, and they often survive thanks to divine intervention. So a myth would be like how the world was created, or the reason we have earthquakes is Zeus or Jupiter being angry and smashing the ground, that, for example. Whereas a legend might be the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur, Theseus being a mortal who goes on an adventure and is helped by the gods. And then putting these into context is something I'd never thought about, and I found it interesting. What's distinct about Slavic mythology is that we have almost nothing that we know of that is originally from the Slavic tribes. So the Slavic tribes first settled in Europe, but they came from the Carpathian Mountains, which is in northern Romania. And they were warlike nomadic people, swooping in huge numbers, and they would travel with herds, and they spread out throughout Europe. And the earliest accounts we have of them are from empires like the Byzantine Empire, looking at them with interest, concern, and suspicion, because this was a huge potential military threat at the outposts of their empire. And so they're studying them with that context in mind. So you always have to understand the person writing the history. Do they have an agenda? And might that color how they're describing the people there? And they were polytheistic. They were also shamanistic. That means that they believed in that things had spirits like trees or lakes or animals, that they were god-like, and there were hierarchies of the gods. And one of the things that would make life easier is if the Slavic pantheon had a direct correlation to the Greco-Roman pantheon, which we know very well, and maybe the Norse pantheon, which we know a little bit, but not a lot. And so we can say that like the main god in Hellenistic terms is Zeus, in Roman terms is Jupiter, they're the same person. And the equivalent of that in Norse mythology is Odin. It's not that straightforward in the Slavic pantheon. There is Veles and Perun and Mokosh and Lado and Lada and Rod and Rodina. There's Dajbog, the god of rain. There are a lot of gods, but their names change, and their names and attributes change depending on which part of the Slavic diaspora you're focusing on. So the Slavs spread out throughout Europe, and that's one of the reasons why Slavic origins can be found probably the biggest diaspora in Europe and North America, certainly, because we have Slavic origins for people throughout Russia. We have Southern Slavic. Yugoslavia means Yugo is southern. So the Southern Slavic peoples, that's Yugoslavia, and the 7 republics that formally constituted it, including Slovenia. We also have places like Poland and Bulgaria and parts of Romania. And it's a huge diversity of places. Czech Republic, Slovakia as well. And each of them have different names or slight variations and different attributes for the god. So it's confusing, even if you've written a book about it. We also have some of the most famous Slavic mythological figures who a lot of people don't realize are Slavic. So we open our book with a chapter on vampires. And not everyone realizes they're originally a Slavic mythological figure. So there's some fun facts about vampires, but just a little bit about how we wrote this book. What we did was do modern retellings of 8 famous myths. And I did the retellings mostly myself, and I had great fun with it. This was the most fun part. And you can read the books just for the myths that are fun to read. And then each myth is followed by a chapter about the history, culture, sociology of that mythological figure. And that's where Svetlana just was encyclopedic, knowing everything about this, and she really led the research and would write first drafts, and then we would write second drafts together and whatnot. So fun facts about vampires. Okay, so the very first published text in a book about vampires was written by a Slovenian, Janez Vajkat Valvasor, who was a Germanic Slovenian nobleman in the 17th century, and is a fascinating guy. He was a member of London's Royal Society. He lived in a castle called Bogensburg here in Slovenia. And he wrote a book called The Glory of the Duchy of Carniola, which is a 12-volume, enormous encyclopedia of natural world and the anthropology of Carniola, which is a northern central region of what's now Slovenia. And he wrote about, famously, the disappearing lake, Lake Cernica, which still exists today. In the summer, it's Slovenia's largest lake, and in the winter, it completely disappears. And places like legends around Lake Bled. And he wrote about a vampire. And he wrote about a vampire from Istria, which is that little peninsula between Venice, Slovenia, and Croatia. The vampire's name was Jure Grando. And he has this story about the first vampire hunter who dispatched with Jure Grando, who died and then came back to life and was terrorizing the village. And it's great fun to read about. And we tell a story that is a Serbian vampire story about a vampire named Sava Savanovic in our book. And then we talk about the origins of vampires, what they were seen as in Slavic mythological terms, and then how that evolved through, especially the popularity of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. But that was really the pinnacle of more than a century of absolute fascination with vampires. But it all began with what was essentially a Serbian Slavic creature, mythological creature. Also, fun fact, because chapter 2 is about werewolves, also Slavic in origin, and for the ancient Slavs, werewolves and vampires were the same creature. It was in the 19th century that they were conceptually diffused. The Slavic word is vukodlak, which would literally mean like wolf fur. And that was considered such a scary word. It's a bit like Voldemort in Harry Potter. You're not so scary, you're not supposed to say it. So instead, people would use a colloquial term like vampir, but it meant this creature who had come back from the dead and would attack relatives and loved ones and would feed on their blood. And he has to be re-killed in all the ways that you can think of from the movies. And they can also transform into wolves. The Slavic idea of vampires is not this humanoid wolf combo. That's a much later concept, but someone who can actually turn into a wolf or is cursed to turn into a wolf. So have you ever seen the Twilight movies? I think probably not on purpose. This is a more accurate to ancient Slavic depiction of what a werewolf is than the concept of someone turning into this man-wolf creature. We also talk about Baba Yaga, who's maybe the third most known Slavic mythological figure, a witch who flies around in a pestle. No, I always confuse the mortar and the pestle. She flies around in the mortar, and the pestle is the stick thing which she uses to propel herself forward. And she lives in a cottage made entirely of bones. And the cottage is standing on chicken legs, so it can walk around. I love this image of this cottage made of bones wandering around. And one of her adventures is in the book. So there are lots of these different approaches we take, and it was great fun to write. So let's focus on Slovenia now. This is a Kurentovanje celebration. Kurentovanje is part of an ancient ritual, but it predates the Slavs. So the Slavs arrived in what is now Slovenia probably in the 7th century. But the rituals around Kurents have been there far longer. It's probably actually a Celtic ritual. Why do we think that? Well, as weird and unique as Kurentovanje celebration looks, and I say this assuming you all know what it looks like, but just in case anyone doesn't, it involves costumes that are made of sheepskin, that have these huge helmets with bull horns on top, and locals dress essentially as benevolent demons who dance around and make a lot of noise to scare away the winter and invite in the spring. And you can find things that look enough like Kurentovanje to show that they're related all throughout a belt of Europe that stretches all the way from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, all the way across through Romania. And it's this sort of mid-level horizontal belt around Europe. And what's in common is all those places were occupied by the Celts. So this is probably actually a Celtic ritual. The other tricky thing with Slavic mythology is because we don't have original Slavic sources written down about the stories, what we have is this game of telephone over centuries. So the stories were passed down orally, usually by an old woman to children. And then at some point they were written down, and then the folktale becomes a fairy tale. But they were written down usually in the 19th century for most of the famous stories. Now, what does that mean? 19th century was a time when Slavic nations were becoming interested in getting independent from the big empires in which they had functioned for so long, most of them in the Habsburg Empire. And so this idea of nationalism is part of it. And these ancient Slavic myths are like foundation stories. So we have the story of Ljubljana and the foundation of Prague as a probably completely apocryphal story of an ancient Slavic queen who founded Prague in Czech Republic. That's an example. We also are having people write it down during the Christian era. And the Slavs were, of course, polytheistic pagans. And the people writing down the stories, turning the folktale into fairy tale, were 19th century, highly educated, devout Christians. So we have a Christianization of the myths. So it gets kind of complicated to try to figure out what the original story is. But now let's focus on Slovenia, and I'm going to just basically tell you two very short stories about Bled. There are lots of stories we could talk about, but these are some very short ones. And one is the story of how Bled Island was made. A long time ago, there was no lake at Bled. There was just a vast meadow where the herdsmen would graze, oxen and cows and sheep. And in the middle of the meadow, there was this hill. And on the hill, fairies would dance on starry nights. And this meant that the cows and the sheep would eat the grass on the hill. Now, one day the fairies came to the herdsmen and said, "Would you please be so kind as to not let your cows and sheep eat the grass wherever they want to? We need the grass as we walk and dance barefoot on our hill." But the herdsmen didn't pay attention to this. They said, "I'll let my cows and sheep graze wherever they please." So the fairies came a second time and once more politely asked, and once more the herdsman said, "I don't care. I'm going to do whatever I want to." This time the fairies said, "If you don't keep the cows and sheep away from our hill, then we will make a fence to keep them away ourselves." Well, as you can imagine, herdsmen being herdsmen, they just laughed and they didn't recognize the power of the fairies. And they said, "Oh, can you make them with your bare hands? With your bare feet, can you make a fence?" I'm sure you can guess what happened next after they teased the fairies a little bit. So the fairies did fence in their hill with water. They opened the mountains and waters flowed down and down and down and surrounded their little hill. And the herdsmen lost their meadow. But we received a wonderful lake thanks to the fairies, who remained safe on the hill in the middle of the lake. And this, of course, became Bled Island, or Bleski Otok. And maybe today they're dancing there still in peace. So this is an example of a folk tale as a myth. So we don't have a god involved, but the fairies are sort of the god stand-ins, and it's explaining a natural phenomenon. Why is Lake Bled there? And it's done, we don't know who wrote the story, if anyone wrote it at all, but it's somewhere in this myth folktale hybrid. Then I'll just tell you one more, the story of Babi Zob, or Hag's Tooth, which is this outcropping of rock on a cliff that's just a short drive from Lake Bled. And it looks a bit like a canine tooth made of rock. So the locals call it Hag's Tooth, and the story goes that it was actually a dragon's tooth, so it's a misnomer. So I interviewed a bunch of locals and asked for their versions of the story, and then I made this sort of hybrid version. I also asked someone who is now in her late 80s. Her name is Dušica Kunaur, and she's probably the most famous teller of Slovenian myths and legends. And she's written dozens of books, and these are the versions, her retellings of oral stories, are the versions that most Slovenes grew up with of several generations, because she's that old. So her version goes like this. There was a village called Dovje near Kranjska Gora, and the story goes that there's still a lake under the village, and a terrible seven-headed dragon lives there, guarding the lake. And everyone was afraid of this dragon because it made terrible sounds. So why did it make such terrible sounds, you might ask? Well, it turns out it had a terrible toothache. So what to do? The dragon knew that giants lived in the mountains around Bled, and on a mountain plateau called Sto. Sto is Slovene for chair. It's Croatian for table, just to confuse things. And one of the giants, named Robaus, was also a part-time dentist. The story is a little weird, but there we go. Yes, a dentist. So the dragon one day went to Bled and found the giants, and he explained that he has this toothache, and the giant dentist said, "Okay, don't worry." And he took his giant tooth-pulling tongs, and 1, 2, 3, boop, pulled the tooth out. "And thank you so much," said the dragon. "I feel so much better." And he turned to leave and go home. The giant said, wait, my dear dragon, are you going to pay me something? You came to me as a dentist. I expect to be paid for my services." But the dragon was full of himself and replied, "Only be happy I didn't eat you." But the giant was not so easily frightened. He took up his tooth-pulling tongs again and said, "Maybe I should pull out another tooth." Now the dragon was afraid, because even dragons are afraid about dentists. "Well, I was only joking," the dragon said, and at least one of his 7 heads said that. "Let's be friends." And so the dragon took the giant to his lake and gave him lots to eat, and they had a good lunch together, and everything was okay. But in their hurry to leave, the dragon's tooth was dropped and it started rolling and rolling and rolling down and down until it stopped at the edge of Jelovica Plateau near Bled and got stuck in the ground. And there it remains to this day. So that's the probably apocryphal story about how Babi Zobor Hag's Tooth cliff came to be. I think we should probably stop here because I want to leave time for questions. I was going to maybe read you one story from here, but it's a little bit long. It's the story of the Waterman, which is based on a famous poem by France Prešeren, Slovenia's most famous romantic poet. And Svetlana and I did a modern retelling of it for the book, but maybe I'll just keep you in suspense and save that for later and turn it over to Nicole to pass me some of the questions that we have. Just want to say thank you so much for your time and hanging out with me. And it's a real pleasure to do this. Nicole, thank you so much for inviting me to be a virtual member of your celebration.
Well, thank you so much for such a delightful talk here. And I loved hearing about both you personally and your experience with Slovenia and your process of, being an American in Slovenia and then finding a way to share some of the magic of the country, as well as how you wrote the book and some of the cool myths that are native to the area. So I love that. So thank you so much for it. And I do want to thank everybody who's been watching and sending in your questions and comments. I will start with some of the ones across related to the myths. Okay, so you had mentioned the disappearing lake of Srpnica. Many Slovenians are also familiar with the idea of witches being present in that region, and I know even to this day, you can buy like tourist souvenir stuff that speaks to the witch theme. Can you talk about more? Talk more about the enduring legacy of witches in this area?
Sure. So, witchcraft was very much present in Slovenia. It was Slovenia. You have to keep in mind, for most of its existence, was considered a bit of an out-of-the-way place that wasn't of particular interest to empires, which was a good thing. So, for example, the Ottoman Empire never occupied Slovenia for the simple reason that it wasn't wealthy enough or strategic enough to be worthwhile. And as a result, they got off relatively easy during times when the war of the Habsburgs against the Ottomans was truly devastating in a lot of places, particularly in Serbia. And this part of the world was one that I'm going to say it was benevolently overlooked, and that was a good thing. It meant that Slovenia existed for centuries within the context of a larger empire, but not really bothered by it. So in terms of the story of Srpnica, we get a lot of our information from this guy, Valvasor, who I mentioned. And Valvasor's book, Glory of the Duchy of Carniola, has a chapter about witches and a chapter about Srpnica. And at his castle, Grad Bogenšvrk, there's a whole exhibit about witches. And part of the reason I mentioned that it was kind of overlooked is it was not a center where people were too concerned about like witch trials and witch hunts, which took place very actively in Germany in particular. This was beyond the interest of clergy or nobles, aside from the relatively small number of feudal, normally Germanic, foreign lords who ruled the territory, and they would speak German, and they would leave the local Slovenes pretty much alone, aside from a few very small, short-lived peasant uprisings. Slovenes recognized they weren't about to overtake the Habsburg Empire, so put your heads down and be humble and have them think well of you, and they're going to leave you alone, and that's essentially what happened. And it was the same case with witches. Witches were not, it wasn't a big thing here. There weren't a lot of persecutions, and they weren't entirely thought of badly. There are stories about things that they do well also, but the main story related to Srpnica has to do with some witches on Slivnica, which is a mountain overlooking Lake Sernica. And the locals said that it was the practice of witches atop the mountain that made the water disappear and reappear. And Valvaso was very interesting because he was living at a time which was like a fulcrum between absolute belief in the supernatural and an interest in finding out a scientific empirical explanation for things. And he embodies this fulcrum because he absolutely believed in the supernatural. Other books that he published were about hydrological rationale for why the lake disappears and reappears. And he came up with something that is pretty close to the real answer. And when he published it, it actually was noteworthy enough that it got him entry to this famous Royal Society in London for scientists. And the basics of it is it's a karst, so porous limestone base in Sernica, and water passes through it. And underground aquifers fill these underground caves with water, and they erupt to the surface, and then they slowly drain. And as a result, the summer it's a meadow, and then come winter it's a lake. And he published this in the book that is still talking about witches, and he's basically laying it out. You can believe whichever you prefer.
Awesome. Our questions are coming in fast and furious here for you.
Okay.
All right. So we have another one related to kind of water, but also the Baba Yaga story that you told. This is from Jacques on Facebook. I read once about old buildings in Slavic countries that were raised up on wood like stilts. Is there any archaeological evidence that Dr. Charney knows of that connects with the Baba Yaga with the house descriptions of these Slavic houses that were on stilts?
That's a great question. There is plenty of archaeological evidence that the earliest inhabitants of the Ljubljana area, they were people like I'm going to maybe give you a link because there's actually a good there's a good museum there now. They lived effectively in a swamp that is outside of where Ljubljana is now, called Barje, and they built dwellings on pylons, so on stilts. So the houses were just above the water level, and they were connected by platforms, and they lived on boats and they fished. And this was for a facility of fishing and for safety. And this was a Bronze Age settlement, so this is a very long time ago. I haven't heard of a connection between that and the Baba Yaga story. The Baba Yaga story is an embodiment of a goddess who isn't purely evil nor the goddess of any one thing. So she's most related to a female goddess called Mokosh, who was a goddess of things that you wouldn't like death, but also good things like fertility. And you could pray to Mokosh if you were having trouble with your husband to make things right. And the form of her as this old hag with a long hooked nose and lots of warts, and this idea of a witch is really from the description of Baba Yaga. This is sort of the universal image we have of a witch. Aside from riding a broomstick, Baba Yaga had a broomstick which she rode a mortar and pestle through the sky, and her broomstick was used to sweep behind her to leave all trace of her and make it disappear. And that she eats children, so we have this kind of Hansel and Gretel vibe to it, and that her house is made of human bones. And the chicken legs, she's more about the concept of transitions between living and death. So the death person and the fertility person, they're combined into one, and that kind of makes sense because passageways from one world to the other, maybe we can think of it in those terms. I love that you know the stilt or pylon dwellers of Bronze Age Ljubljana. I don't think there's a relation, but it's an interesting idea.
Thanks for that. Like I said, we've got a bunch of questions. So I guess we've talked about some of the mythology related to the country. This is from Carolyn on Facebook. Slovenia is famous for its caves and karst topography. Are there any stories and myths that incorporate this unique geography? I know we've talked about a couple of them. The lake in Sernica. Talked about also the karst. Do you just want to kind of rattle off a couple of them that come to mind?
Sure. So I'm going to have to think about if there's a specific myth related to the cave systems. There are stories of dragons living in the cave systems. The most famous two are Postojna, which is world famous and on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And it's very easy and much touristed. You actually go through much of it on a train. And it's a bit Disneyfied, but it's still very cool. The one I like best is called Skocjan, which is more, you have to hike through it, and it's more like being in the mines of Mordor from Lord of the Rings. It's very dramatic. So both of them have stories related to the idea that you could find baby dragons inside caves. And the baby dragons were people's reaction to seeing what are called human fish, or olm, or Proteus anguina is the Latin term. These are all the same animal. They're indigenous to Slovenia, but they also appear in some Croatian caves, so it's not exclusively to Slovenia. But they look, if you've ever seen one, you should Google one now if you haven't, human fish or olm. They look like translucent salamanders. They're blind. They're not very big, but they're the largest cave-dwelling creature in Slovenia. They eat only every few months or even every few years. And they're the icon of Postojna Cave. It was big international news when one finally had a baby in captivity, because they're not used to captivity. They also don't like exposure to light, so it's very hard to see them. But they have human-like skin. It's pink and translucent, and it's an amazing-looking creature. And people who saw them thought that they were baby dragons. So that's that's not a whole story I'm telling you, but that's the first thing that came to mind to answer the question.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I know a lot of people who have been to Slovenia have seen the human fish, and I've seen them, and it's really cool. So that's a neat connection there. More kind of a question culturally, I guess. This is from Bonnie on Facebook. Do Slovenians today embrace the folklore and myths of Slovenia, or do you think that this is something that has been lost or more unknown?
I think it's been lost to a very large extent, especially under the younger generation. For example, my grandmother-in-law, the schnapps champion, still does something that is an ancient Slavic ritual that I don't think she knows is an ancient Slavic ritual, because she's very enthusiastically Catholic, and this is a pagan thing. But so every Easter, people take butarice, which are these little, they're basically like pine bouquets that are dyed bright colors, and every Easter you bring it to the church to be blessed. And when she brings it home, when there's a thunderstorm, she breaks off a piece of it and throws it in the fire, because she thinks that it'll keep the house from being struck by lightning. That's an ancient Slavic pagan tradition that's been Christianized. In order to bless it, she takes it to the church instead of taking it, to the wooden altar to Perun in the forest, maybe. But it's something that I'm not sure how many people of a younger generation are doing, but a lot of these ancient rituals were Christianized, or they were merged with Christianity. And if we look at the history of Christianity, all the holidays are based on pagan holidays. So the initial transition from paganism to Christianity was as seamless as possible. So it's pretty easy for them to merge together. But the younger generation, I'm not sure how many people see things like Kurentovanje as a cultural ritual and a fun parade. But it's more of a spectacle than anything else. And I'm not sure how many people actually believe in some of the things that people in this part of the world believed in for millennia, but that's probably the case just about anywhere we go. Our problem is we know too much, and we don't need these stories to explain things away. So they become things that are charming, and if we feel a sense of cultural connection, and we tell them for that reason, I think that's okay too.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. Oh man, we have so many here. So here's one that has that came in from Kara on YouTube. You mentioned that there are multiple versions of the Slavic pantheon across the different Slavic countries. Do you know which version of the pantheon is found in Slovenia?
Yeah, so the Slovenia one is linked to the Yugoslav versions of the stories. As part of Yugoslavia, Yugo just means southern, so these are the southern Slavs. But as soon as you say that, it sounds like we're talking about one unit, but then you get into it, and southern Slavs is, Montenegro, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, Slovenia, you name it. Slovenia also was the ex-Yugoslav country that was most influenced by Austria and parts of it by Italy. So it's really the least Slavic and the least Balkan of all of the Yugoslav republics. So it's probably the least authentic. And the further you get into rural areas, less developed and further from influences of neighbors, the more authentic it probably is. But the main distinction we make is there's the Northern Slavic or Russian versions, which are the most frequently written down into like a canonical text and most frequently depicted in works of art. Then the Czech version is probably in second place in terms of Slavs have always thought that Russia and really St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Prague were the cultural beacons of Slavic everything. And there's something to be said for that. So that's probably second place in terms of influence. And Slovenia is not particularly influential at all from that perspective, but we're getting lumped in with the Southern Slavs, but we're probably as the least authentic of the bunch because there's such an Austrian influence here.
Well, thank you for that. And I think we have just hit a nerve with our audience here. And I think people are thinking about stories that they've heard their whole life. And when you're presenting it, it brings sort of an academic context to it. And it's causing us to go back into our memories that we have had for so long and really revisit some of those stories in a different way. So thank you so much for this. I'm going to move on now to some travel questions and personal questions. You mentioned that places in Slovenia, some places have quote unquote too much tourism, and there's real measured effort to prevent over tourism. At the risk of disrupting that idea, what is your favorite hidden gem? Where is a place maybe that if you had a good friend visiting you, that would be on the top of your places to take them?
So I live in Kamnik, and I'm a big fan of Kamnik as, let's say, the fourth place you should go to, because everybody's going to go to Ljubljana, everybody's going to go to Bled. Then the third place is probably going to be the coast and Piran, and that has a very different feel. And then the question is, if you're going to stay long enough, what else do you see? And I like Kamnik because it's a beautiful, small, very livable medieval town. It's got 3.5 castles in it. If you come visit, I'll explain why I call one of them half a castle. And it's also right next to Velika Planina, which is the thing that I think is most remarkable. If you're unfamiliar with it, you should Google it. It is completely otherworldly. It looks like something from Middle Earth or Narnia. It's a mountain plateau where herdsmen have grazed cattle for literally millennia. And it developed its own culture and rituals that don't exist anywhere else. It also has its own cheese called Trnic, which is famously, they're shaped like boobs and they always come in pairs. So they're the boob cheese, which people think is very funny, but this is local only to Velika Planina. And it's really a remarkable place, especially to spend a night. There are these cottages that, again, look like something, I don't know, from a Viking settlement from 1,000 years ago. And it's really a beautiful place. So that would be my first choice. I would also send you to Jezersko, which not enough people know. It's right on the border with Austria. And I would send you to do a schnapps tasting at Svet Gora in Jezersko. And if you're curious, you can learn more about it. If you go to Atlas Obscura and search for my name, you'll find a couple of articles about food travel in Slovenia. And there's one that's a profile of this woman who calls herself the Blonde Witch, who makes the most amazing schnapps concoctions I've ever had. And so I'll pick those two places to send you to.
Oh, those are some good recommendations. And I know people are right now thinking about their summer travel, looking for flights, booking tickets, trying to make an itinerary. So that's some very actionable and useful recommendations. Thank you for that. We do have a question from the Consulate General on Facebook, so I don't want to ignore this one. Can we get his book, Slovenology, in the US? If yes, how? Great question. Thank you so much. So I'll just say this. At this time, you cannot readily get Slovenology in the United States or outside of Slovenia. And maybe, Noah, you can talk more about that. But however, I will say, Cleveland Kurentovanje, we have put in an order, and we will be receiving some author-signed copies of Slovenology available for purchase soon. Not this weekend. We will not have them this weekend. So I'm just putting that out there. But if you sign up for our newsletter, you will get notified of when that book is available for purchase, and we will send out some information at that time. But it will not be available this weekend, so please have no expectations of that. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, it's published by a Slovenian publisher called Beletrina, and it's never been available easily outside of the US. You can get the ebook version on Amazon, and I recorded an audiobook version, but I recorded it in like 2018, and I'm not quite sure why the publisher hasn't gotten their act together, but at some point there'll be an audiobook version as well. But otherwise, you can order it from a Slovenian bookstore shipped to the US, but you have to navigate either with Google Translate or the Slovenian website. So most people don't do that. So, if you can get it through Cleveland Kurentovanje whenever it arrives, that's the best way to do it, and you're supporting a good cause.
Thank you. Yeah, and we do want to thank the publisher. They have created an opportunity for us to create fundraising from this. So we will be selling it at the MSRP price, so you won't be paying more than retail, but a portion of the proceeds will go to the festival to help allow us to create more free programming like this in this year and next year and years to come. So we thank them for that opportunity. All right. A question about you personally. What is your cultural heritage?
Oh, geez, I have nothing to do with any of this. Just American Slavic, I guess. From my parents, great grandparents came over from Belarus and northern Romania around 1900 something. And my surname's actually kind of a funny story. So Charney's not the original surname. It was probably Charney, that we might spell Czerne. But at Ellis Island, I guess he would be my great grandfather, who was a tailor, came over, and he was trying to explain to the guy checking him in at Ellis Island, I think this is 1906, that his surname, he couldn't communicate what his surname meant, so he figured he'd say what his surname meant rather than was. So he said it in German, Schwartz. And the Ellis Island guy wrote that down as his surname. So my grandparents' surname is Schwartz, which is German for black. And my father changed it back to an Americanization of what was probably the Slavic word Černé, or black in it's not exactly, because it's Chornya in Russian, but so it's a little bit of a mystery. But yeah, there's no connection to Slovenia. I also lived in Italy, and everybody thought I must be Italian or something like that. No, we just chose Slovenia because my wife is Slovene, but we were going to live anywhere that was going to be the best place to make a life and raise kids. And we decided from an objective perspective that Slovenia seemed like about as good a place as any could be.
Thank you. That's, I think a lot of people have that same wondering of where am I from, and to know those roots is really quite special. Thank you for sharing that. Mm-hmm. I also want to make mention too that you had mentioned at the start of your talk a number of the books that you've written, prolific author with lots of information I think relevant to or of interest to the people watching this presentation right now. We will email out a link to a page on our website with links to purchase your books. And we have set up an affiliate program through Amazon, and we will be able to get a commission to benefit the festival from sales of those books. So if you are looking to purchase books from Noah, please check that out, so that you can support the festival with your purchase of those books from Amazon. Okay, I think that is probably, we're at an hour and 20 minutes, and I think that's probably going to be all that we have time for today. I do want to give a very sincere thank you to you for your time and generosity with your expertise, your interest in Slovenia, and just sharing so many great stories about Slovenian mythology and everything related to that. Before we close out, do you have anything else that you want to add for the people who are viewing this presentation right now?
Oh, it's just, I'm really honored to be a part of this. It's a great cause to support Cleveland Kurentovanje. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to be in touch with me through my website, noahcharney.com, or through social media, or Nicole can put you in touch. And yeah, I hope to maybe see you in Slovenia sometime.
Thank you. We appreciate your time so much.
Thank you all. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Take care. Before we end, oops, do we end? Oh, we're still. Okay, before we end, I do want to also invite our participants to check out the upcoming events that we have in today's schedule. Our presenter, Allie, talks about is one that weaves both the history and the handicraft and her own personal family's heritage into one, and it's really captivating, and we'll have a live Q&A with her. She is one of the only or very few subject matter experts on Idriales located here in North America. Then on the Tuesday, we will have a cooking demonstration of a very easy and very simple to make in half an hour priamshnita. It's definitely one you don't want to miss if you want a quick and easy, delicious dessert. The wine tasting is, we did actually sell out of this very recently, so thank you to everybody who purchased tickets, and we look forward to seeing you at Slovenia National Home for the wine tasting. If you do not have a ticket, unfortunately, we do not have any more tickets available. Then we have on Thursday, Prešeren Day, and this is going to be in person and broadcast online. And it was a wonderful event sponsored by the Consulate General. It will be a night of jazz and poetry, followed by a tour of the Deemer Mansion that has a large and expansive collection of the fine art of Gregor Porušek. And also, this is a very, very rare opportunity to see the Deemer Mansion. The interior, it has not been open for many years to the public. And so this is an event you don't want to miss. Then we have an in-person exhibition. It's the opening at the Slovenian Museum and Archives. The exhibit is covering Slovenian sports. And so this is a very special exhibit. We have a lot of memorabilia that has been brought to Cleveland from Slovenia, as well as great information. So don't miss that. And then finally, festival comes to crescendo on Saturday, February 10th. With our 5K, you can still register for the 5K. We have the parade kicking off at noon. Our children's village is open with free face painting, crafts for the kids, and lots more. We have 3 stages with live music and performances, and then food and drink are available for purchase. So the entrance into the festival grounds is absolutely free, and we welcome the public and everybody to come and enjoy themselves. And we look forward to seeing you, and do stay around until 5 o'clock for the closing of the festival, which includes the burning of the effigy at the end, the proofs, and it's a spectacle that you do not want to miss. Very special cultural display in Cleveland here. If you want more information, please go and see clevelandkurentovanje.com for all the event details and more. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Noah Charney for his time and generosity of information. And thank you to you, all of our participants, the sponsors, our grantees, partners. It takes a village. So thank you for and we look forward to celebrating with you more this coming week.